Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This video is a review of the Shout Factory Blu-ray release of a truly underrated genre classic, which is 1966's Island of Terror. Now, this film is actually quite interesting. It seems like it would be your average run-of-the-mill sort of forgotten, lower-budgeted science fiction slash horror film of the 1950s, but it was actually made and released in 1966, so it does very much feel like a little bit of a throwback. It also is and has been claimed in some quarters, or at least some people see it as sort of a very thinly disguised remake of producer Robert Gorton's most famous film, which was actually Fiend Without a Face, which is rather infamous for its sort of shapeless, brain-eating monsters and the sort of gore it had for a British film in the late 1950s, and is very beloved among genre circles. And you've probably seen the famous image of that film of the guy with the sort of brain-eating monster attached to his neck and on the back of the side of his head. But what makes this film unique and interesting and really important is it was directed by Terence Fisher, and it was directed by Terence Fisher in the midst of his run of iconic Hammer films. And after a certain point, he actually, towards the end of his career, and in terms of the later years in the 60s when he was at Hammer, he seems to have at least maybe, I don't know if he fell out of favor somewhat with the higher-ups, but he started getting slightly less directing assignments, and he did accept a couple of jobs in between films and in this particular period outside of Hammer. So if you look at his filmography, you'll notice that while it's pretty much dominated by Hammer for most of his directorial career, after a certain point in the 60s, really the early to mid 60s, you'll see that there's a couple films that are not Hammer, even though they may have a lot of Hammer regulars and even have some of Hammer's most iconic stars, because of course you have Peter Cushing here in this film. This is, in some ways, I would describe, probably I think the best way to describe it, if you've seen a lot of 50s science fiction, monster on the loose slash horror films, or anything in the sort of 50s science fiction genre, you'll know that there are, obviously a lot that have a lower budget, and sometimes there's a certain charm to them where the lower production values don't hamper the film as much because the people who made it actually cared, and there's some intelligence in the script and performances, and they really did the best with what they had. And those, I think, are usually the best of, for example, the 50s monster films or irradiated monster films. In fact, this very much reminds me of what I think is probably the best of those, which is The Monster That Challenged the World, which is extremely successful because it relies so much more on suspense and actually characters doing relatively intelligent things to try and stop a seemingly unstoppable force that they have to really struggle with. And if they don't act quickly, it will continue to spread and grow and cultivate more of itself and literally possibly destroy the world. So there's a sense of a ticking clock. The character's intelligent, and even though the production values are on the lower side, it relies more on using its brain than what most 50s monster films would do. And in fact, that film, I feel, very much inspired the unseen shark idea in Jaws. I think this was the film that was in the back of Spielberg's mind, because when you see this film, while it's not exactly the same, for the majority of the film, it is relying more on suspense and more of the Hitchcock, or especially the Val Lewton technique, and that's when it's at its best, and I think you can draw the parallel to Jaws. Well, this film really much does that, and honestly, if you didn't know it came out in 1966, and you overlook the fact that Peter Cushing is slightly older, because it is the 60s, this very much fits in with what, early Hammer was doing when they had very little money and they started making their science fiction films, and they had their success with the Quatermass experiment, and then jumped into X the Unknown, which I have here behind me on the Shout Blu-ray, which was a similar science fiction tale, but much more straightforward and nowhere near as artistically challenging and groundbreaking as Quatermass Experiment was, which I do think that film is a masterpiece. But X the Unknown has great charm to it, and you can see Hammer playing around in science fiction with some horror elements, and this was before they jumped into their gothic horrors fully. So there was a time at which Hammer was doing science fiction horror films in the 1950s, and they could have kept doing that. So it was possible we may have not even gotten the iconic Hammer Gothic horrors, and the company probably would have never have gotten as big as they did without those. But there's a real chance that we could have seen Hammer go more into science fiction, or at least continue to do sci-fi films, because for some strange reason they wouldn't really return to the field until they finally did a third Quatermass film, Quatermass in the Pit, in 1967. So they really decided Gothic horror was more of their thing, I guess. But Island of Terror very much fits in that sort of early Hammer style and what started the real golden age of Hammer horror films, particularly under key director Terence Fisher, who really created so much of the Hammer Gothic style that he is not only the key Hammer director, but there's so much of his sort of personal stamp, I think, in the golden age of Hammer films. And he, of course, did some of their non-horror films as well. So he is really like the key creative voice in terms of production for the majority of the iconic Hammer films. So to have him directing a science fiction film with tinges of horror, very much in the sort of classical 1950s science fiction monster/horror film, it very much fits. And so you would think that this is basically like a 1950s Hammer film that got away, and you even have the great Peter Cushing in there. Except that it was made in 1966, and it wasn't made for Hammer. It was made for Planet Film Productions, which was a new production company Robert Gordon tried to get off the ground. And so this is obviously going to be a very low-budget affair, and it's again pretty much at least somewhat heavily based on the producer's previous Fiend Without a Face. It's very much a similar plot, which itself is very similar to a lot of the 1950s Monster on the Loose films that have been created by some sort of scientific experimentation. So, this kind of feels like a film that's out of its time element, and I think that everyone involved in the production was able to sort of catch on to that, because what makes this film work and what makes it special is not only is it actually proceeding along with intelligence, and the characters actually react in a realistic, believable, and intelligent way. They're not just running around like idiots and doing stupid things because the plot tells them to. But there's also a sense of humor and whimsy that enlivens everything. And I think this was something that was probably injected more in the production of the film, because I think cast and crew recognized that this was, even by 1966, it was rather old-fashioned, and it was very much something that could be, well, I mean, the basic script itself idea, it's pretty hokey. And in most people's hands, this would turn into just another hokey, old-fashioned sort of holdover from the mid to late 50s science fiction craze that somebody would have used to pad out a double bill. And this, of course, was actually sent out as a double bill with another Planet production, which was not very good. So, it should be a sort of forgettable film. And Fisher did do one or two other films of this type, like The Earth Dies Screaming, which didn't turn out to be, all that much, but I do think there's at least some interesting elements in everything Fisher ever did, and I, of course, that makes me think that these films are better than their reputation. But it's the injection of the humor along with the believability of the characters' actions, and the plot setup being about entities that cannot be stopped, seemingly, and all the characters have to use their brains to try and figure out how to stop them, and everything they try, it turns out to not work, and the tension continues to build because the monsters keep growing and dividing. So you have the sense of a ticking clock. You have characters acting relatively in believable ways. There is some inherent hokiness because, of course, the budget was quite low, and this was not even a Hammer production, and it very much feels like a holdover from the 1950s in terms of the story. But I would recommend this film to anyone because it's just so much fun and well put together and well executed, and has such a sense of heart and spirit to it that it's quite adorable, actually. So the plot in and of itself is, very much derived from what you would expect in a 1950s monster film. We have a small island, which I believe is off the coast of Ireland, where you have a team of scientists locked away in an old estate that they've rented and turned into their sort of lab, and they seem to be working on a cure for cancer. And we have just the briefest of glimpses of the lab, because we are actually then thrust into the main titles by a very sort of cheesy, hokey effect when something goes wrong in the lab, and we flash red into the main titles with the sound of breaking glass. And essentially, what has happened is, in the process of the experiment, something has been generated and has killed all of the scientists, unbeknownst to anyone else around. Then we have various members of the island community knowing that something is kind of off when people start disappearing, and then the sort of local constable makes the grisly discovery of a corpse, but the unique identifier of the corpse is the fact that it has no bones in it. And you have these corpses turning up of both people and local animals and livestock that have had all of their bones seemingly just removed somehow, and just almost as if they had been disintegrated. And so we don't see a whole lot, because this is still the 1960s, and Terence Fisher had a great sense of taste. But you see people looking at remains that are obviously quite gross, and simply the imagination can run wild with that idea. Then our constable, as he naturally would, because again all the characters behave in believable ways, goes to the local physician, Dr. Landers, who's played by Eddie Byrne. So right here we already have a pretty notable Hammer regular face pop up, as this film is peppered with a lot of actors and actresses you'll recognize from Terence Fisher directed Hammer films. He investigates the corpse and finds he's very much out of his elements, so he goes to a pathologist he knows of, who just happens to be Dr. Stanley, played by Peter Cushing. And the joy in Peter Cushing's performance is the key reason why you need to see this film. It has been said by some Cushing fans that this is probably the closest you ever come to the actual man himself, in terms of his intensive sense of charm and humor and delight, and the twinkle he could have in his eyes. He is just magical in this film, and he laces every line of dialogue with a sort of witty remark or sardonic tinge, or just this wonderful sense of delicious humor throughout. And it's this quality he starts injecting that I think the rest of the film picks up on, because it runs as an undercurrent throughout the entire film. Even when things get really heavy and it looks like there's no way out, or they're in situations of peril, Peter Cushing will throw in just this wonderful tinge, and that just makes the sequences magical, and everyone else picks up on those. And it's just an energy you don't expect for this kind of film, and that's why this is so unique. And it also furthers the sense of this film having such a beating heart to it that it's just adorable. Cushing's pathologist is also perplexed by this, so he suggests they go to a specialist, Dr. West, played by the really incredible Edward Judd, who unfortunately didn't have a terribly long acting career, but he's excellent in this film. He also picks up on that sort of sardonic quality that Cushing injects, except where Cushing's humor is a bit lighter, the character of Judd has a sort of darker tinge, and he's more, maybe with a little touch of brooding, but he goes more for the darker sardonic tinge. But it's not just that they go to see him and get his opinion and go back to the island. No, they go and find him at his apartment, where he is romancing his love interest, Toni Merrill, played by Colleen Gray, and it's actually she who gets them a way back to the island and insists on going along with them. She gets them a helicopter ride there, and they actually get on a helicopter at night and fly back out to the island, and they're going to essentially be stranded there until the helicopter can come back, so they think everything's fine. This gets all four characters back on the island where the pressure cooker has started to build because the deaths and mysterious happenings have increased. Now, the local villagers are, pretty simplistic. We don't see a whole lot of them, but we do see enough to get an idea of what the community is like. The head of the community, the sort of local mayor, is played by the always incredible Niall McGuinness. But unfortunately, probably my biggest issue with this film is that they don't really give anything to him to actually do outside of trying to keep the people calm. It is a believable character and performance, but it's just not up to the sort of it's not the sort of caliber of part that's worthy of such a brilliant actor. So unfortunately, he does feel a little bit wasted here, but he does give a brilliant performance that's totally believable, as does pretty much everyone in this film. Now, it is very quickly uncovered that when they go to the lab and realize that something went wrong in the experiments that had been going on, what had been generated is actually a relatively unique monster. It is a silicate, which is essentially an organism that feeds off of the minerals in bone. So it's basically what they were trying to develop to fight cancer cells basically took on a life of its own and is now growing and spreading and subdividing at will and merely looking for other things to feed on. That's why every corpse or animal turns up dead and without any bones left in it. They are simply drawn into and absorbed by the silicates. Now, the silicates themselves have a rather interesting design, but obviously this is a low-budget film, so they move so slowly that due to the shape, they kind of almost look like maybe a weird sort of turtle because they have this sort of almost green shell-like shape. And then there is the sort of stalk with the almost sort of eye on it that sticks out and will move around and latch on to people and things. So, it's very obvious that they did not have a large budget and they did the best they could, but at least the design of the creature is quite unique. And they are shot and staged in a certain way to be as effective as possible. And the real sort of intensity factor about the suspense of trying to get rid of them is you can't really destroy them, and everything that they try obviously doesn't work, and they even get to the point of chucking sticks of dynamite at them, and that doesn't work. And if that were not bad enough, after they reach a certain point, they start subdividing, and that's another little sort of amusing bit because the first time we see this happen, it's relatively well done, but it's obviously it looks almost like the sort of liquid in bits that's generated when they subdivide into two. It almost looks like it's chicken noodle soup, actually. So there's a lot of little amusing qualities about the lower production values. And while obviously it's never going to be as effective as a film with a much higher budget, it's the ingenuity and the spirit of each of the sequences and the fact that the film is so endearing that it makes these qualities honestly all the more charming. So the film continues to build with an increase of the tension and suspense. There are a few other admittedly inherently silly bits, like when they're actually trying to stop a whole forest full of the silicates. One guy tries to shoot one of them, and somehow there's a silicate that got up in the tree above him and falls down on his head, and you have to wonder how the heck it got up there. And then there's another bit where our lead doctor characters go back to the lab, and there's a big door marked radiation keep out, and they go in and actually go in a couple times, but they have to go in and retrieve a radioactive isotope, and there's this sort of extended sequence where they're putting on admittedly rather cheesy looking radiation suits, but it also goes into the fact that they are trying to make this as believable as possible. And with props Peter Cushing, who was obsessed with getting props and details just right. He performs this scene as if he was doing brain surgery. So the performance is still as perfectly intensive as you would expect, even though the suits look rather comical and they're obviously not real protective suits. Peter Cushing still performs it as if it is. But there's just such a sense of warmth even as things get increasingly bleak, and we do build to essentially a siege of the town by the silicates, and the sort of last-ditch attempt that the scientists try, because they've tried everything else, and so they're basically having to try and see if this last attempt will work as the silicates are laying siege to the last surviving members of the town that have all gathered up in the last remaining building in the town center. And the tension ratchets up to the absolute maximum, and it is extremely well done and very believable because the characters and the performances have that element of realism. Nothing is stupid or over the top or cheesy, and I think the undercurrent of humor that's injected throughout helps to make them feel a bit more three-dimensional, because they use humor to try and undercut their own tension, and that of course makes it so much more easy for the audience to relate to the characters and the situations, because it seems like real people, and there are people who will crack jokes even in the most dire of situations. And Peter Cushing in this film is pretty much like a one-liner machine. If there's any reason to see this film, chiefly among them is the fact that this is perhaps the most charming I have ever seen Peter Cushing in a film. And as soon as this film started, it was just, where has this been all my life? And it is masterfully handled by Terence Fisher in the director's chair, because had anybody else made this, none of this would work. I mean, it would have seemed very much like what it was, a lower budget sort of holdover from the 1950s, obviously a B-film programmer with a bunch of cheap puppets moving around that was supposed to be monsters. And the script would have been much more obviously simplistic, because it is a simple script. And had it been handled by anyone else, had anyone else's hands been the ones shaping this, I don't think it would have worked, and it wouldn't have had the charm or the heart or the humor, the sardonic quality, and the believability. So it's those qualities that really elevate this, and it's an incredibly well-made little film. It's extremely effective. Yes, there is some inherent hokiness, and the sort of bookends of the film that go into our opening and end credits are definitely cheesy. So don't let the opening sort of throw you and make you think that this is going to be a dumb film, because it's actually not. It's just sort of the constraints it has, the sort of elements of how it was made and who produced it are what make it look that way. But in reality, it is not. It is one of the most surprisingly enjoyable science fiction horror films I think you're ever likely to see. And there's so much of the sort of classic Hammer spirit to it that for me, it plays much more like, what if Hammer Films had made another science fiction horror film with a sort of monster on the loose type approach in the late 50s, early 60s, with Peter Cushing in a lead role, directed by Terence Fisher. Except that this was made in 1966 by Planet Films on a low budget. You know, it's just, there's so much Hammer in here that it really feels like it's a Hammer film. This is one of those sort of films that I think most people would see it and think it was a Hammer film, and I think they'd be right to think that, because there's so much of the Hammer spirit and there's so many Hammer cast and crew that it has that sort of Hammer flavor, and it has more of the charm of the sort of earlier Golden Age Hammer horrors, and that's what makes it so remarkable. This is a charming film that is well done, that has a sort of has a monster that has an effect, but also a sort of inherently goofy charm to it as well that overcomes the inherent hokiness of the low budget and everything. So I find this film absolutely delightful. I think it is great, and it should have a better reputation. And I think everyone who sees this comes away with a similar sort of feeling, because it's just really well done, and it definitely gets on your good side very quickly and never strays from that. And it has such heart and such humor and such, at least a degree of rationality in the character's actions that I think this is an unheralded little gem. So now we turn to the Shout Factory Blu-ray release, which is by far and away the best video release of this film that has been done to this time. Now, unfortunately, while this is a widescreen HD master in the 1:8:5 ratio, this seems to be an older Universal master, because Universal handles it here in the US, and it has all the hallmarks of a lot of their older masters. So I would say this was done many years ago, because it is a film transfer in terms of from some other element. There is a lot of baked in damage. You will see a little bit of wobble, some occasional marks and specks and things. It does clean up rather well, and I also watched this upscaled to 4K, and it still held up, relatively decently. I was surprised at how good an old Universal HD master could look, but it also has the hallmarks of some of most Universal HD masters from years ago. It does seem like there's a little bit of over sharpening, and there is, some noise in there, and it probably has been degrained a little bit and then over sharpened. So if you'll know what a Universal master from like the 2000s is going to look like. Well, this seems exactly like that. So had Universal made a video release here in the US, they would have used this master on DVD somewhere, and this seems like what would have turned up on a Universal DVD. So unfortunately, it's not a new scan. There is some damage baked in. The credits also are slightly lesser quality, because it seems like they're duped in or something. So you will notice a slight quality drop for the credits and a few other light things. But I think the biggest things you're going to notice are the sort of over sharpening effect, shots or moments that have a lot of transfer noise in them, and then the occasional line or tiny bit of wobble or frame damage. But it's at least relatively minor, and overall this master does hold up pretty well. Unfortunately, because this is such a sort of not discussed or not very well known film, I don't think anybody's going to be giving the original negative a scan anytime soon, but hopefully there could be a newer transfer done at some point, because this is such a lovely, charming little film that it would be great if we could get a newer transfer. However, for what it is, this master is still relatively solid, and it looks okay on Blu-ray, and it even looks okay upscaled to 4K, so I was at least pleasantly surprised there. Although a new scan could really bring out more of the visuals and make the color a bit better and not seem so flat, because obviously this was an old transfer, probably done from scanning like a US interpositive or something that Universal had. So it's obviously several generations away, and there's some damage baked in. So it's basically an old Universal master. I mean, it is what it is. And of course, that means it has all the negatives of being an old Universal master. Now, we do get the original mono track and lossless quality, and it also sounds pretty good. But once again, this is an old Universal master where the audio hasn't really been cleaned up or messed with. And the big thing here is the dialogue does frequently have a harshness to it. That may be inherent due to the sort of nature of this production being lower budgeted, but you will definitely notice that the dialogue is frequently, there is some harshness there. I think if they do a new scan, I think the audio could have a better presentation, and that might lessen some of that. But again, the dialogue harshness just might be a sign of the lower budgeted production. There is also a tick or two, and there's not really a major amount of noise in the track, but you can definitely tell this is a source of at least limited quality that was part of this old HD master. So just like the picture, the sound does have some inherent defects and some defects from it being an old Universal master, but it's still perfectly presentable. And again, I was pleasantly surprised that at least this being an old master, it did play well even on a modern 4K setup, and the mono track sounded relatively healthy healthy, even with those inherent limitations of this particular transfer. Now, to look at the artwork and packaging, Shout has given us a pretty nice amount of original and new artwork. This is actually a reversible cover, so it's done in the style of all of their standalone Hammer releases. And then we open to find nice art on the disc label, and of course the reversible art as well. So they at least put some, extra flair on the actual packaging, but this is still an old Universal HD master. So this is like their Hammer releases, where it's sort of a mixed bag of new scans and old masters, and you kind of have to sift through and figure out which is which, because they're all I think they're all overpriced, because Shout always has an overpriced sort of built into their higher list prices, but not all of their releases are new scans, and you also have to look for encoding issues even on the new scans and things. So the Shout releases of the Hammer films are always a mixed bag for me. So at least they did this film in about as best that you could do with the pre-existing Universal HD master, but I would have wished this was at least a new scan. Now, in terms of the overall extras, we do actually get a couple, and they're quite solid. So this is like the Hammer releases Shout has done, where they have generated a few new extras, and that at least makes the overall Blu-ray release more enticing to collectors. The primary extra is a new commentary by Dr. Robert Kiss and Rick Pruitt, who comes in for a little bit of the track. This is a very well done commentary. They basically go over every production aspect of the film. This will enhance your entire viewing experience. And if you were like me and you really enjoyed what you saw in the film and wondered how it came to be and things, the commentary goes over all of that. And then, rather amusingly, when Rick Pruitt comes in, he actually talks about the experience of seeing this film first run in its double feature at a drive-in, and is wonderfully able to remember all the little details about the particular night he saw the double bill with Island of Terror at his local drive-in. So if you love getting the vintage theater experience, or you maybe wondered what this played like on the original run, well, he gives you a blow-by-blow account of going to a drive-in and seeing the Island of Terror double feature. So this is a good commentary. It's very fun. It's very easy to listen to, and is really essential to go along with this film, because outside of this, you're not going to find out a whole lot of information outside of some generic information online or reading the Wikipedia page or things like that. So it definitely digs in deeper to the production of the film and is a really great commentary. Then we get a little stills gallery, which is nice, but the images are mostly lower res, and it's one of those where it's just a couple minutes just zooming in on photos and things. So it's an actual video piece, but it's nice whenever you get any sort of other extra. And then we also get the original trailer, which unfortunately is old standard def and is in 4:3, but it is scanned from an actual film trailer, and it does seem like there's some color fading, but at least gives you a sort of different idea of how this film looks from some kind of film element, even though it's an old faded trailer and done on standard def. And it's great when we have any kind of trailer, because unfortunately so many trailers don't survive, but at least they've included that here. It just would have been nice if they had found an actual film trailer to scan, especially for this release. So those are my thoughts on the Shout Blu-ray of Island of Terror, which I think it's a hidden gem. That's the best way to describe this. This is probably my overall favorite 50s monster on the loose film, except it was made in the 60s. And I just adored this film because of the sense of quality craftsmanship, the fact that the characters behave relatively in a believable, realistic manner, and the sense of charm is off the charts. I mean, even when in what probably the film's most notorious bit, when Peter Cushing's character actually loses a hand to one of the silicates, and that's actually a shot that was only in the US version. The commentary goes over that. It was cut out of the UK release, and it is present here in the Shout release, again, probably because Universal's master was from like an old US interpositive or something. So this is the uncut version of the film, because it has that one little slightly actually gory bit, but it's also kind of amusing how it's too. But when Cushing's character basically has to, loses his hand, he's still cracking jokes and being sarcastic. And if that doesn't sell you on this film, I don't know what will. This is, again, probably and I think Cushing fans are right. Everything I've ever read about the man seems to indicate this is the closest film performance you get to who Peter Cushing really was and what he was really like. And every other character picks up on this, and it's an undercurrent that runs through the whole film, and it again adds such a layer of believability. And without this, and without the actors and Terence Fisher picking up the material and trying to make it play and make it a bit more three-dimensional and basically trying to stamp out the hokiness, this would have been hokey and it would have been forgettable and just a low-budget B programmer 50s holdover when it turned out to not be that. So this is a film that gets looked at in terms of the sort of production, and that's how it's sort of judged. It's only the people who actually see this and who are Terence Fisher fans or Hammer fans or Peter Cushing fans, and you come away with such a sense of this is a special little film. There's such charm here that you just love it. There's nothing to really nitpick. It overcomes all of the low budget and lower tier production quality to really be surprisingly effective. And it has such a beating heart that I think everyone comes away charmed by this. So I would recommend this film to anyone. It is an absolute must for Hammer fans. And if you're a Peter Cushing fan like me and you've never seen this before, go and find this immediately, and you will just have such a delightful time. You'll probably wind up adding it to your yearly October horror marathons and watch it every single year, because this is basically, Peter Cushing, the one-liner machine, the movie. And it's absolutely a blast. So if you're interested in this release, it is a Shout Factory Blu-ray, and it's still available, and this is really the only good, proper HD version you can get. And, it does go on sale, and you can get it for cheaper, which I think is the way to go, because having this at like a full $30 or more list price, I think, is a bit much. Although we do get a nice new commentary, so that does help to sweeten the deal, but unfortunately it's still an old Universal HD master. So with that said, I do hope my babblings about films, classic horror and science fiction, Hammer, and physical media have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep supporting both boutique and studio labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.